Welcome to the deep dive. This one's for all of you serving in the military. We're tackling some serious strategy today, diving into Carl von Clausewitz on war. Specifically Book 7, chapters 1 through 5, where he really gets into the relationship between attack and defense.
Definitely still relevant today, even though Clausewitz was writing almost 2 centuries ago. What I find fascinating is how he breaks down this idea that attack and defense are separate, like totally opposite things.
You mean it's not as simple as one side attacks, the other defends?
Right. He says they're totally intertwined. Like Clausewitz argues that every attack has built into it this need for defense. He calls it the original sin of an attack, almost like a burden every attacker carries, because defending, like say securing your supply lines, that takes time and resources away from attacking.
So even when you're on the offensive, there's this inherent need to think defensively. You're pushing forward, but also having to protect your flanks, your rear.
Exactly. Think about a modern military advance. Even with air superiority, you still need to secure those supply lines. That's inherently defensive. And the further you push into enemy territory, the more you have to defend, the longer those supply lines get. It all gets even more complicated.
That makes a lot of sense. So he calls this need for defense the original sin. But he's not saying it's a bad thing, right? Just that it's this inherent tension at the heart of every attack.
Exactly. It's all about balance. Think of a boxer, right? If they just throw punches nonstop, yeah, they might overwhelm their opponent at first. But if they're not thinking defensively at all, they're wide open to a counterpunch.
So how does a commander, even today, balance that need to keep pushing forward with the need to secure what they've already taken?
That's where Clausewitz's idea of the culminating point comes in. It's that moment, that critical point when the force of your attack is kind of dot spent, and you become much more vulnerable to a counterattack. Think about the invasion of Iraq, for example.
Interesting. Was there a clear culminating point for the U.S. in that operation? And how did that change the conflict?
Well, it's debated, of course, but some people argue that the U.S., because they advanced so quickly at first, that led to their supply lines being stretched really thin, and that made them more vulnerable when the insurgency started. It's a classic example of how even a successful attack, if it goes too far, its own momentum can become a problem. And that's why Clausewitz is still so relevant today. It's about adapting to the situation on the ground, understanding that the balance of power can shift at any time.
So you're saying it's not just about pushing forward no matter what.
Right, not at all. It's knowing when to consolidate, when to maybe focus more on your defenses, shift from that pure offense to a more balanced approach. Clausewitz is really hammering home this interplay between attack and defense.
It's like he's saying, don't get stuck on just attacking just because you're the one advancing on the map. You always have to be thinking about defense.
Exactly. It's in every battle plan, every operation, and it's even more complex today with all the different types of warfare we have now.
You're talking about cyber warfare, information operations, that kind of thing. But how does Clausewitz apply to those domains?
That's what's so interesting. Even though he's writing back in the 19th century, his ideas are still relevant to modern warfare in some surprising ways. Like, take cyber warfare, a well-timed cyber attack. That can cripple your enemy's command and control, right? So it's almost acting as a defensive measure, even though it's technically an attack.
Wow, that's a good point. So even in a realm as different as cyberspace, Clausewitz's ideas about this back and forth between attack and defense, they still make sense. It's about the principles behind the tactics.
Yeah, absolutely. He was trying to teach people a way of thinking about warfare, analyzing the situation, and adapting when things change, which happens constantly, obviously, and that's something any military leader can use, no matter what their specialty is.
It makes me think back to something you said earlier about every attack having within it the original sin of its own defense. How does that idea play out today?
It's about recognizing that tension. Let's say you're planning a big offensive. You want to hit them hard and fast. But you also need to think about the logistics, all the support you need for that kind of operation. You got to secure your supply lines, your comms, have a plan for medevac.
Right? And those things, those logistical concerns, that can sometimes limit how effective your attack can be.
For sure. It's a balancing act, always. Clausewitz forces you to think about those trade-offs. How much risk are you willing to take?
It's about choosing your battles, basically.
In a sense, yeah. Choosing your objectives carefully, understanding what you might lose, and being ready to change your plans when the situation changes, which it always does.
And that's where that idea of the culminating point comes back in. Knowing when you've gone far enough, when it's just too risky to keep pushing.
Exactly. Every offensive, no matter how good your plan is, no matter how well you execute it, it's going to run out of steam eventually. The key is Can you see that moment coming and change your strategy?
This is really insightful. It seems like Clausewitz is really making us think beyond just these basic definitions of attack and defense. He's showing us a much more complicated relationship there.
That's right. And it's that nuanced understanding that helps us apply his ideas to modern warfare, even with all the technology and everything else that's changed.
So for our listener out there, someone serving in the military today, what's the most important takeaway from Clausewitz on attack and defense?
That is a great question. I think the most important thing is internalizing that dynamic relationship between attack and defense. Don't get too hung up on labels like attacker or defender because warfare isn't like that. It's fluid. Understand the principles of attack and defense, how they work in different situations, and constantly adapt your strategy. That's how you stay ahead.
Be adaptable. Think critically. Don't underestimate how complex war is.
Exactly. And always remember, just like Clausewitz said, even in the most aggressive attack, there's always that element of defense. You can't escape it.
Such a good point. Now, you mentioned Napoleon's invasion of Russia earlier. Could you talk more about how that campaign shows what Clausewitz is talking about with the culminating point?
Oh, absolutely. Napoleon's march on Moscow in 1812, it's the perfect example of what happens when you ignore or misjudge that culminating point. He went deep into enemy territory, won battles along the way, but the cost was huge.
His supply lines were stretched thin, his army was ravaged by disease and attrition, and when he finally reached Moscow,
He found a burned and abandoned city.
not the decisive victory he was hoping for.
Not even close. And it just proves what Clausewitz is talking about. Napoleon, he won a tactical victory, right? He got to Moscow. But strategically, he'd pushed way too far. His forces were exhausted, vulnerable, and that long retreat back to France decimated his army. That's the danger of ignoring that culminating point. You might get what you thought you wanted, but at what cost?
It reminds you that winning a battle doesn't always mean you've won the war.
Exactly. Clausewitz makes you think beyond just the immediate situation, that tactical level, and consider the bigger picture. It's about being able to sustain your attack, being able to adapt, and realizing that warfare, it's always this back and forth between attack and defense.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Clausewitz, what's the one big takeaway you'd want our listener, a military leader wrestling with these very concepts, to walk away with today?
That's a tough one. But I guess it boils down to this. Warfare is this dynamic dance between attack and defense, always moving, always changing, always uncertain. And what Clausewitz gives us, he gives us a framework, a way to think through that uncertainty, understand how attack and defense work together, recognize the things that contribute to that culminating point, adapt to the changing battlefield. That's how military leaders can make better decisions, the kind of decisions that lead to success.
It's about being adaptable, thinking critically, never underestimating just how complicated war really is, even, or maybe especially, when you're the one attacking.
Perfectly said. And with that, I think we've done a pretty good job unpacking these chapters of On War.
I think so too. We've covered a lot today, from the connection between attack and defense to how important logistics are, to the constant risk of hitting that culminating point. Hopefully, this deep dive has given you, our listeners, some serious food for thought as you continue to navigate the challenges of military strategy in the 21st century.
It's been great joining you for this deep dive into the brilliant mind of Carl von Clausewitz.
And until next time, keep those strategic minds sharp, everyone.